All right. Hey there, folks. Since book tour and conventions are still on hold somewhat for a bit, I figured I'd bring book tour to you. So welcome to Russ's Rockin' Rollercoaster Season 4, intriguing interviews with creative minds. With us tonight is JOE R LANSDALE, the international best-selling author of 45 novels and 400 shorter works, including stories, essays, reviews, film and TV scripts, introductions, and magazine articles. He has been recognized with more awards than I can list here, and his work has been made into the films Bubba Hotep, Cold in July, as well as the acclaimed TV show Hap and Leonard. Welcome, Joe.
Hi, thank you. Glad to be here. Appreciate it.
Good to see you. All right, okay, just a heads up for the folks at home. Feel free to send me notes or questions you have for me or Joe in the chat box during the show, and we'll get to a few at the end. All right, Joe, as we always do, we're going to start at the beginning. So where were you born? Where'd you grow up?
I was born in Gladewater, Texas, which is in East Texas, which isn't real far from Louisiana, as is where I live now, Nacogdoches. I've lived in East Texas all my life. I spent a short time in a little town called Mount Enterprise, went back to Gladewater, graduated high school, and though I've traveled a lot, that's been my landing spot, so to speak.
All right. So what was it like? So
I live now in Nacogdoches, I should say that.
Yeah. Okay. So you're still on the East Coast of Texas. So what was that like? So talk to me. So tell me, you're a kid. You had brothers, sisters, or was it just you?
I had a brother, but there's no coast here. We live higher than the coast.
Right.
We consider those Gulf Coast. We're East Texas. We're special. And yeah, I have one brother. He's approximately 17 years older than me. My father was 42 when I was born, and my mother, I think, was 38. And my brother's just short of being 17 years older. So he was pretty much out of the house. We joke that we both grew up as only children.
Right. Are you guys close now?
Yeah. As soon as I was old enough to know who he was, when he would come visit, because he was, he had his own life. He was in Memphis. He tried to record music at Sun Records when I was a child. Of course, I was very young, and he ended up going in the military. And the lady he met graduated high school with Elvis Presley.
Oh, really?
And so he got to meet Elvis via her, and he met Johnny Cash and all those people because he was just around there, and those people weren't those people yet. And so he's still married to the same lady, and 60 something years at least. I don't want to. I guess he's 87, 86, right. 87, something like that.
Wait, yeah. So go hold on, go back to that part again. So if your brother was sort of, he was in the music world for a while. What did that rub off on you in any way? Did you become like a music fan through him, or how was that?
I'm a music fan. I'm sure that contributed, but I think that too, when I was growing up, it was a revolution of music in the 50s. I remember hearing Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash the first time their stuff came on the radio. I was a child, and I wasn't aware of it, but within that short time, just down the road from us, playing live in the radio station, singing live, was Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, Ray Price, and on and on and on. And in fact, that radio station has become a music production. Now, I mean, they record music there, and my daughter, who is a professional singer, recorded 2 songs there because Elvis sang live in the same place where she recorded, so she wanted to do that.
Wow!
And so that place is still there. But as a kid, I had no idea that they were just down the road from me. And of course, then they were just beginning to be, who we think of as those particular personalities.
Wow! Is that still part of So where you are, is that is that history still like ingrained in the culture of where you are right now?
It's here. It's not as well known as it should. In Gladewater, I wrote an article about Gladewater and about its musical legacy because everybody played in Gladewater. In fact, Gladewater, just like the Grand Ole Opry and Sun Records, and for Elvis and them, like the Louisiana Hayride, for example, I'd say the Sun, Louisiana Hayride, and then Gladewater were among the most important places they played.
Right.
The hotel where Elvis stayed is still there, and they have a card where he signed his name. Now it's now like an apartment building and stuff, but it's famous for that, and still has the sign out front that says air conditioning, which was a big thing then when I was a kid. Oh my God, air conditioning, because we didn't have that.
Right.
And Johnny Cash wrote "I Walk the Line" in Gladewater.
Is that right? Wow.
According to him. Yeah, according to him.
So,
Yeah, and Jerry Lee Lewis in that place where we were talking about that was a radio station that's become a recording studio. He wrote his name into the soundboard, and they had that mounted on the wall, and they had the signature authenticated.
oh, that's
Less authentic is that there is a in the one of the sound rooms where you can listen in. There are these marks along near the floor that they say is where Johnny Cash put his foot against the wall and leaned back. Now, whether that part's true, I don't know, but we
whoa.
do know that is Jerry Lee Lewis's signature on the soundboard that they have mounted there. And there are pictures of Elvis recording there in that very room, which looks just pretty much the same as it did back then, except the recording equipment has changed. But and when I was a teenager, I remember going to that radio station and looking in and seeing them doing radio work at that point. But I didn't even really know that Elvis and them had been there until I was older. And Gladewater kind of covered up its history. I don't know that they did it purposely, but it happened. Elvis and Johnny and all of them, they were on that tour. They were on that part of the music tour, and they would come through Gladewater, and it was and Elvis stayed at people's houses. There's all these photographs of him with all these families, and in Gladewater at the Gladewater Museum.
Oh, is that right?
I'm also an artifact. I'm in the museum, and they have stuff of mine. But Elvis kind of got like his own 2 or 3 walls there, which he well deserved.
Sure. So let me ask. So speaking of Elvis, because this obviously, he's still the king.
Absolutely.
When he came out, obviously there was, the big, more broadly, oh my goodness, look what he's doing. He's shaking his hips. This is horrible. Is that part? Do you remember that? Was that in your neck of the
Absolutely. Absolutely. I remember that. I remember when he played on Ed Sullivan, and they didn't want him to, vibrate. And I remember, people talking about how vulgar and stuff he was. And I remember my mom liking him.
Of course, because he was beautiful.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And the thing is that in short time, a lot of the men that I knew that were thought, he was, they came to like him too, because he was very Southern and he was very polite. And those things appeal to the general audience.
Right.
They didn't know what was going on behind the scenes, but as usual, people judge people just based on little bits of information, especially if they're celebrities. But Elvis is my favorite singer to this day. And Cash is another one, and Lewis is another one, and all those people of that era, along with later in the 60s, the people that influenced my feelings and emotions that I put into books sometimes were people, like the Motown and the Beatles and, Jimi Hendrix and, people like that, Cream.
Yeah.
So on and so on. We don't want to get off on music. And then I listened to, blues, because there were black stations that I could turn in at that time, because they used to be separate. They used to call them race records, the stuff that they recorded. And I would listen to somebody like Muddy Waters.
Right.
They're called race records.
I never heard that. Oh.
And in fact, there was another, I think they did Phillips International was his other label that he came up with. And that may have been to record primarily black artists. I'm not sure. I know he did that at one point. And because B.B. King and Elvis were, they knew each other. They both recorded at Sun,
So
I believe B.B. recorded.
So being in Texas was, did Buddy Holly have a connection for
Absolutely. And Bob Wills is still the king, when it comes to the kind of music he did. My daughter actually played with the remains of the Texas Playboys and the Bob Wills band. She was we were at some event, and they asked her to come up, and she sang a few songs with them. So
cool.
I got to meet them, and I got to meet the guy who flipped the coin with Richie Valens. And had he lost the toss, I would have been talking to Richie Valens maybe.
Wow, is that right? Wow, they really flipped.
That's right.
That's a true. So that's a true story.
And I think, and I'm not, and Waylon Jennings was in Buddy's band too. And Waylon Jennings flipped the coin with Buddy, I believe is how that went. And Buddy got the plane.
Is that right? I never heard.
Yeah.
That. Wow.
Yeah. And Jennings felt bad about that till the day he died. And the fellow Tommy, I'm sorry, I can't think of Tommy's last name, who was in the Texas Playboys, and at that time with the bands that were flying out that night, he was Richie Valens' best friend, I think.
Gee,
Certainly they were very close because he's still bothered by it to this day too.
wow. God, I mean, how?
I'm not sure Tommy's still with us, but he
Right.
was. The last time I saw Tommy, Bill Paxton took me to see Harry Dean Stanton playing somewhere in, I don't know if it was Austin or Fort Worth. I can't
Right.
remember. And when I looked up, there was a guy on this up there playing the guitar, and he looked down. He said, "Are you Casey's dad?" And it was Tommy with Texas Playboy.
Whoa, wow, that's
But
great.
Bill brought me over there to meet Harry Dean Stanton. And
Oh, very cool. Wow, very cool. So let me, so all
yeah,
right, so obviously we covered music. So what kept you busy
yeah.
as a kid? What was your jam? So you growing up, what were you into?
Well, there were a lot of different things. I was an outside kid. I played out a lot. I lived in the woods. I was kind of like Huck Finn with a house to go to at the end of the day.
Right.
And I did the usual go to school things. But I played a lot of chess with people that would play. And main thing I did though, besides playing, was I read. And I started out with comic books. When I was 4, I learned to read so I could read the comic books faster than they were able to read them to me. And I would just memorize them at first. They read them and I would memorize them. And when they tried to skip something, I would go, "No,
Right,
that's
right.
not
Oh,
what he
wait.
said." He
Yeah,
said,
yeah.
"Yeah, right. You know how kids are." And so pretty soon I was reading, and then I loved the DC comics in particular, Batman,
Right.
and the classics illustrated led me to starting to read Jack London and Mark Twain and Rudyard Kipling, and and I fell in love with all of those books that I could get. We didn't have a library because at that point I'd moved from Glaywater to Mount Enterprise, which was about 150 people. So I would catch the bookmobile when I could. And there was a kid that didn't like to read, but he would go in and let me pick books that he could check out and he would give them to me. So I had my share and his share. And then I would go back and turn them in when the bookmobile came back because I would read them all in just a few days.
Right.
And neighbors would loan me books. My mother would find used books. We didn't have a lot of money. We were poor. We weren't poverty stricken, but we were on the lower end of the financial spectrum.
Right.
And my father was a mechanic, worked for a place called Wanda Petroleum. He could not read or write. My mother was a big reader, and she's the one that encouraged me to read. And my sister-in-law, my brother's wife had a lot to do. She bought me comics and encouraged me to read. And yeah, and I think I did. I believe I dedicated my very first novel to her. I know I did. Yeah, my very first
Wow.
novel to her because she always was supportive, and both my parents were supportive. I don't have the usual story that a lot of
Right.
people have, but what I would say is that around me, though, there was not a lot of support. Not that I asked for it. I
Right.
never felt like I needed it. But
Right.
a lot of the people I grew up with around me had no idea what the hell it was I wanted to do, nor did they understand what it meant. And early on, all I knew is I wanted to write. I didn't understand that in the broader sense that it was a career and that you made money at it. And, I just knew that's what I wanted to do.
Right.
And by the time I was about 10 or 11, I read Apprentice of Mars, and I no longer wanted to be a writer. I had to be one.
Right.
And that's the book that tipped the pot over for me.
Really.
And so I began to think of it that way. And I knew I was going to do it. I never doubted I was going to do it. I've been far more successful than I ever expected because I didn't really know what to expect.
Right.
And I assumed that I would write part-time. I thought I would get a degree in at that time in anthropology and teach and then write part-time. And then I never got the degree, and I started selling when I was 21. And when I was 29, I was full-time. The rest of the time I dug ditches. I worked in an aluminum chair plant. I did all the usual, carpenter's assistant, which
Oh, wait.
really meant assistant.
Go back for a
Yeah.
second. Go back to the
Yeah.
digging ditches part. How long
Yeah.
did
I
you,
dug ditches.
how long?
Well, I did it off and on a few times, but I remember my mother said, if you don't get an education, you're going to end up digging ditches. And damn, she was right.
Wow.
My very first job was digging ditches, and what I was digging them for was sewage lines. They were, putting sewage lines in, and they put
Okay.
in pipe. Back then, they were still using clay pipe.
Right.
They just started using plastic pipe, around that time. But a lot of it was clay pipe. Some of it was plastic pipe. I was a bouncer a little bit off and on. I worked as a farmer. My wife and I had a goat dairy and a farm, and we did that for a couple of years. I worked at Goodwill Industries as a publicity guy. I ended up being a janitor for 7 years. And when I was 29, I'd been selling all along. I went full time. And after a few precarious years there, 3 or 4, I've been doing it ever since.
All right. So hold on. So you're skipping over all the good stuff. So hang on.
Okay.
So, all right. So I want to ask you. So you've done pretty much everything there is to do. You've done to make ends
Blue
meet.
collar wise.
Yes, I believe me. I've had 40 or 50 jobs myself. So let me ask you.
Yeah.
So over the years, I've dabbled in martial arts, including Tai Chi.
Yeah, I did that too.
Right.
Still doing it.
But I'm fairly certain if you and I were to ever throw down, it would be you throwing and me going down quickly and painfully. So tell me about your passion for martial arts. Talk to me about this.
Well, when it actually started with comic books because I was a big DC comic fan and Batman was my man.
Yep.
And in Batman, in those comics, which Batman was somewhat differently presented at that time, but he would do boxing and then he would do a judo throw and they would mention, judo, boxing, jujitsu, whatever it was. And I wanted to do that. And then my mom one day realized I was trying to do stuff I didn't know how to do because I'd seen it in the comic book. I remember there was an issue of Black Cat, and there was only one issue of it, and it was a female black cat. There was another black cat, but it had judo tips in the back. So I was trying to do those, and my mother said, well, your dad was a boxer and a wrestler, right? And I was like, no. And my dad, what he had done and like I said, he was 42 or so when I was born. So they had gone through the Great Depression. He was born in 1909. And I always tell people to put some perspective on that. Mark Twain was alive. Mark Twain died a year later. Wyatt Earp died in 21 or 22. And so did Bat Masterson. Annie Oakley lived, I think, beyond that. So and Buffalo Bill died in I think 1917, maybe. But you're talking about a total overlap in history there, so that puts some perspective on that.
So go back.
I went to him during,
right.
What's that?
So tell me tell me about your dad's time as a boxer. I want to hear about that.
Well, that's what I'm going to.
Oh, okay.
But I wanted to put it into perspective. So during the Great Depression, that's when they were coming into their young adulthood. And so one of the things he did, he worked all kinds of jobs, whatever he could get. But one of the things he did is he would catch a train, which meant that he hoboed. You either caught a boxcar or you got under it and held the rails, right. Wrap your legs and arms around it. And he would go from town to town to the fairs where they boxed and wrestled for money. And it was the beginning and the creation of what later became professional wrestling. But at that time, it was just people trying to see who could whip somebody's ass at the carnival and get some money.
Right.
And so when he was there were people who knew a little bit of what they call Japanese tricks. That's what they used to call judo. And in the judo, even when they referred to it, this is trick number 1, trick number 2, what have you, Right. And my daddy had picked up a few of those things, but he was mainly a boxer and a wrestler. And so he started teaching me when I was 11. And by the time I was 13, he worked a lot, wasn't able to keep it up, but he's really my first instructor. And he wasn't a great teacher, and he was also extraordinarily strong. So he could get away with physical things that other people couldn't. He could tear phone books in half, bend coins, smash apples with his hand, snap belts with his chest. He was that kind of guy. And he was little. He was 5'8".
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah,
so
5'8".
So short.
I saw him one time jump up, kick a door with both feet off the hinges.
Right. Wow.
But he got me really interested in it, and so then I started taking judo at the YMCA. And about that time, Hapkido had been in the U.S. for about a year or two, and my instructor was a guy who had been in the Army in South Korea, and he had studied there from what they called the old man. So that could be maybe the original old man or just a military term for, who instructed him. But I know that my instructor was not really far removed from the creator of Hapkido. Wow. People don't realize that Hapkido was created about, I think, 1948. Huh. Because Choi had been a servant for the Daito-Ryu master, Takeda. But I won't get into all that because I'll start going. But anyway, I went from one martial art to the other. Taekwondo was new. and it looked nothing like the Taekwondo you see now. It looked more like Shotokan. It was 60% feet, 40% hands at that time. And then I got into, I met some people who knew a little jujitsu, and I was doing all this at the YMCA. I lived there after school. My mother would drive me over there. It was about a 30-minute drive, and then she would pick me up. And then on the weekends, I would go over there and spend all day Saturday in all these classes. And I met these people from Thailand who did Thai boxing. And so I got interested in that. I can't say that I started studying it severely then, but a little later. But like I say, that's all. There's more to it than that. And I got into Kempo and all these other different arts and Daito Ryu and all that later on. But the point is, he got me interested, and I learned a lot of it at the YMCA, and then I branched out from there by accident. People just kept showing up at the right time in the right place.
Wow. So let me ask, so my first introduction to your work was about 30 years ago when I read.
Oh, that hurt.
I know. It hurts us both, right? When I read some Jonah Hex comics.
Yeah.
So tell me about that.
Well, Jonah Hex, I'd already been around writing and selling for many years by the time I was asked to do that. And I grew up on Jonah Hex in the 70s, early 70s, I think. I guess I was 18 in 1970. So I was, somewhere around 1920. I don't remember exactly when those first appeared. And I read them and I loved them. And then Tim Truman, the artist, was asked to work with me and I with him because they felt his style complemented my writing style, which I agree with. And Tim and I are like brothers. I love him dearly. And, once we met, we were hooked on each other as friends. But I remember Jonah Hex as being more fantastical than it was. And so when they sent me the older copies of Jonah Hex, and I actually had a few in storage, and I hadn't seen them in years, and I read them. I still liked them, but I thought, my God, they don't have any fantastic elements.
Hey,
they
Joe, for those here who are watching who don't know Jonah Hex, just give a quick blurb on Jonah Hex.
Jonah Hex is a Western hero with a scar where his teeth shows through the side of his face, and he was very popular, but he became more of a cult sort of character, and Tim and I revived him in the mid-90s. But I think the difference is that when I wrote him, I gave him more of a supernatural or offbeat sort of touch, and we recreated him as an East Texan. He had a Confederate background, and we tried to show that he was growing in different ways, but yet he had Confederate roots, and we just accepted that. And it made him dangerous. It made him deadly because he'd been in the Civil War with people like Bloody Bill Anderson and the James Gang. And so he came out of that a better person than they did.
Did you ever, I'm just curious, there was a run that came out maybe, I don't know, 5 years ago on a book called The Sixth Gun, which feels like a descendant of Jonah Hex. Did you ever read that?
Yeah, it is a descendant of Jonah. He's a fan of mine. In fact,
he is? Okay.
And I have all of his stuff. I think he's absolutely terrific.
Oh,
yeah. And
great
he's told me that my work, and I don't know if I've also written weird Westerns and weird Western short stories. So, but I certainly think The Six Guns, good stuff.
All right. So we skipped around a little bit. So let's just take one step back. So tell me, what was the first, when did you really get serious about writing? What was your real sort of, when you considered yourself, I'm just starting to break through? What were you working on at that point?
Well, the first thing I wrote sold was a nonfiction piece, and I wrote it with my mother, and it was just a few paragraphs long, but it got published. I think it was almost a year and a half after we wrote it that it was published, and it won an award as best article. And it was just a few paragraphs, and it's under Ulrita Lansdale, which was my mother's name. And so we split maybe $25 over that. But even then, I knew that was it. I knew that I was going to do it, but I was working a lot of other jobs. And after I'd been selling lots of articles, my wife told me one day, she said, look, you've always wanted to write fiction. And I was working in the rose fields at that time, and the weather was so awful. And I just found a dead man in a creek about then too. So it made me think I need to get serious. And this was mid-70s.
Whoa. Go back. Tell me about the dead man in the creek. Go back to that.
Well, sadly, we were working and it was very icy for East Texas at that time. There had been rain and ice. I mean, you'd go out and look off your porch and it looked like the poop deck of Noah's Ark. And so the next day, the rain cleared a little, and my boss came to pick me up at my house. I didn't live far from where he lived, and he owned the rose fields, and I worked for him. And as we were driving to the rose fields, as we were coming to this bridge, which was very precarious because it had been iced over, we looked off, or he looked off to the left, and he said, "Look, there's a toolbox down there." And I thought, yeah, it looks like one. And so he pulled down off the road, and we walked down there, and there was a toolbox like you see in the back of a pickup truck. And it was lying down there. And then when we looked under the bridge, we could see the pickup was like this. It ran off during the night because the bridge was covered in water. The water had rose that high. And he was dead in there. He looked like the Pillsbury Doughboy.
Oh, geez.
I remember that to this day. He was swollen, and his flesh just looked like marshmallow, like you just reach and tear it off. It looked so soft.
Right.
His head was that big. It looked like he had Mickey Mouse gloves on. I mean, I'd never seen anything like that. But the fact that I realized how precarious life was made me want to do the job, you know, and before that, I would just write when I wanted to. I'd write an article and I'd sell it, because I sold every article I wrote. But when I started writing fiction, it was different. My wife told me, she said, well, the weather got so bad I couldn't work in the rose fields. She said, why don't you, I've got a job now. I'm working at Southland. And she worked in one of those refrigerator trucks where you bring lunch meat in. She had to wear like a regular, like an Iceman's outfit, you know, looked like a hazmat suit, really. And so she would bring the lunch meat and put it in there. And she had that job. She said, why don't you take 3 months off and do nothing but write, and figure you out a schedule. And said, and when I come home, you damn well better have something, because I'm going to be in that damn freezer all day long. And so when she came home, I'd write a short story every day. I wrote a short story a day for 90 days. I wrote 90 short stories.
Wow.
And they were all awful. They were awful. But what happened is I learned how to discipline myself. I used martial arts training, and I used fear of my wife, and I used desperation. And I sat down and I would write every day. And over 4 years' time, because back then it's different than now, you had tons of magazines. Right. And you know, every magazine bought stories. Right. And I didn't really know how to market. I'd never met a writer. I didn't know how that worked. And I got hold of a thing called Writer's Digest, which I ordered, I think, from seeing it in Writer's Digest magazine. Right. No, this was called the Writer's. I can't remember, but it listed all of the publishers and all of the editors and what they were looking for. And sometimes I didn't really read that well. So I sent 90 stories out, and over 4 years' time, and this is absolutely legitimate because my wife and I kept track of it. Some of those stories were rejected 10, 15 times a piece because you had so many places to send them. Right. And you sent them by mail then. It isn't like now. That's one reason it took 4 years. Right. And when it came back, I'd send it out again. If it started looking ragged, I'd retype it. And I was doing all this on a manual typewriter. Wow. I wrote those stories one a day on a manual typewriter, and I would send them out again. And we got 1,000 rejects over 4 years, literally.
Wow. Wow.
And we had a big burning of those and the stories when we moved to Nacogdoches. I kept a handful of them, which later on I did place, but I did that. We had the ritual burning and got rid of those. But I kept the rejects, most of them, not all of them, but I kept some rejects, and they all appeared in a book I sold to Subterranean Press, where they did a limited edition of all these older stories that fortunately I had kept. I wish I'd kept them all now just for this kind of posterity volume. They did 2 volumes of it. And in the first volume, the publisher in the special edition put one of those rejects in every one.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So listen, Joe, so at this point now, you've written novels, comic books, essays, scripts, and more. Do you have a preferred venue for writing, or do you just love it all?
I love it all, but I'm addicted to short stories. That's my favorite thing to do. It's not that I don't like other things. And novels would be second. And then after that, I suppose it would be screenplays. And then I like writing, comic scripts pretty well. There are, I did stage plays. I even did poetry, which, I won't call myself a poet, but I do have a book of poetry coming out. Uh, but to me, it's writing is what I'd love to do. And there have been times when the idea of writing a screenplay was more appealing in that moment, or a novel. But short stories are really my natural meter. And it's weird because as a kid, I never thought that I would write short stories. I thought that I would write novels and maybe one or two short stories. And I started writing short stories because my wife gave me 90 days.
Right.
And I also figured that it was be a good way to learn better how to write. And when I started doing it, I found that I adored it. And I was reading tons of short stories every day as well, because I would spend a portion of the day writing, portion of the day reading. And then later, when I went back to it, I would work at night it was either midnight or 3 pages. And then I would go back to work the next morning, because by that time my 90 days were over.
Right.
But I learned so much by learning that I do better writing shorter periods of time.
Right.
And to write every day and get away from that stupid idea of inspiration, which is just absolute bullshit. And because I'm inspired all the time now,
right?
Because I did it to the point to where it's like lifting weights. You do it enough, you can do it.
Right.
And some days are better than others. But I found that the days when I looked at my material, when I thought I was inspired, was really not all that different from the days I didn't feel inspired.
Right.
And so I set myself a 3 to 5 page minimum, which made me a hero every day. Right. I set myself a 3-hour work day. Eventually that arrived at being in the morning, as that became my full-time work. And some days I'd get 10, 15, 20 pages.
Right.
And I polish as I go. I don't do multiple drafts. That just confuses me and irritates me and saddens me. And so I would write one draft, polish as I go, reread it the next day, because it was usually 3 to 5, maybe 7, 10 pages, except on those glorious days. And I would have many when I would get more than that, but I would reread it, polish as I go. And then when I finished, all I had to do was then do just a polish. There wasn't this whole rewrite from word one to the end.
Oh, that was a real sort of, so basically your wife was almost like your, you went to basic training and she was your drill instructor.
I did.
Right?
Yeah.
Said, you got 90 days, soldiers, drop and give me 90.
Right. Well, I owe my career a lot to my wife, not only for that, but just because she's never doubted me. She never said you need to be doing anything else. Of course, I worked other jobs. I've never admired those people who say, I'm a writer and an artist, that I'm so involved in my art that I can't do a job or I can't take care of my family. Right. I really despise those people, to be honest. And, my dad was a working man. My mom was a worker. And, we all believe in doing your job, and we all believe in toting our own pail. We've got to help each other. But my wife and I, there were times when, I was doing all the work, and then other times she was doing all the work that was business work, meaning bringing in money. But we were always working. When I was a house dad, for several years while my wife worked at the fire department as a dispatcher. And I would write and take care of the kids. That was my job, to do both. Right. And her job was that she would work, for 24 hours and then be off for, 48 or whatever it was. And then she'd go back on. She had a different schedule. And so we always supported one another. But in 1988, when I'd been a full-time writer 9 years, she went to work for me and never quit. She's kind of semi-retired in recent last couple of years, but she handled all of our business. She handled my daughter's early music business. My son had jobs, and so he didn't have to have that. And then now he's also a professional writer. He's had a couple of movies made, and he works as a stockbroker along with it. And so, we've always been supportive of one another and helped one another. And my wife, their mother, has really been the heart of the whole organization, because it is an organization.
Right. That's amazing. So listen, I want to ask you something. I want to shift gears a little bit, because the world is obviously going through all sorts of changes. But I recently saw a post on Facebook in which you were asked, and this, if I remember correctly, and I think I'm paraphrasing, that your attitudes about using rough or pretty un-PC dialogue. And I've seen myself that readers are becoming maybe more discerning about what's fair game in fiction and what's not. And what's your take on the pushback from those who feel like maybe you're ruffling their feathers with your sort of take no prisoners approach to writing?
Fuck them.
Yeah.
You know, here's the thing. Here's an example. Politically, I'm probably to the left, but as a writer, I'm neither left or right.
Right.
What I am is I'm writing those characters. And I think sometimes you write things that are uncomfortable. Sometimes you write things that are ugly. Writing is supposed to be at its best willing to, not necessarily has to, but be willing to be offensive.
Right.
Because I'm trying to make points. If I'm making points about racism, I'm going to discuss racism in your face. And if you can't take that, that doesn't mean that it's racist material. It's pretty obvious in my work, I think. And I try not to make it, spell it out, but I think it's pretty obvious that I'm very much anti-racist, or I'm anti this, or I'm pro this, whatever. Those things seep through the books. But I also do it in such a way that it's not that simple. There's things where there's people that, like, for example, my father was my hero, but he was very racist, especially in his rhetoric, though he didn't treat people that way. And a lot of the people that he dealt with on a daily basis when his mechanic shop were black people. Right. And he was always helping them and going, he would go squirrel hunting to eat for us. And he would always kill extra squirrels for the black family. So in other words, these things are complex. Right. There isn't, and we're trying to get to this point where it's black or white. And I don't mean that in the racial sense of black and white, right. But just that this is good, this is bad. I didn't like that. And, there's a line that you can draw, and you can step too far in either direction. You can be so good that you're bad because you get to where you can't call somebody on what they've done. I think we're developing a victim culture.
Yes.
And I think that this whole idea about what can I be offended about next? Well, how can I be offended for somebody else more than they're offended? Right. And to me, I'm deeply offended by certain things, but right. A writer is supposed to be a writer. And that means that if you have something to say in writing, if everybody is a good character and a happy character, it doesn't work. And I don't think that black people can only write about black people, or white people can only write about white people, or women can only write about women, or men can only write about men, or any gay about gay. We're all people. There may be differences. There's going to be areas where we don't understand one another, but segregated fiction is the worst idea ever thought of. And having somebody come in and say, you didn't say this correctly, and we have this thing in our publishing house that you use this word that could be offensive. Well, I meant for it to be offensive, right. And not necessarily in the way they're offended. They're offended in a different way. It's like Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, one of my favorite novels. And one of the things that made me realize racism around me and change me as a child, because I grew up with racism. I didn't know it was wrong. People couldn't, but Twain is hated by the right wing for being anti-racist, and some of the left wing hating because he uses offensive words or says things just like they were and presents the truth right up front. And to me, the fact that both sides are offended means he's doing something right.
Yes.
And
yes, right.
I think I learned so much from that when I was, and people say it's just the same now. We always need to change, and we're working it, but it's not just the same now. I agree with John Lewis. If you, and he would know better than I, being a black person, but that doesn't keep me from having feelings about it. It doesn't keep me from having seen things. It doesn't keep me from having experienced things. So white or black, I have a point of view. And in fact, I had somebody say to me, yeah, you like Mark Twain and you like Harper Lee, but they're white and you're white. Well, white people have to have an introduction to racism too, from their own side, because that's where they're seeing it. And then once I did that, I began to read all of these black writers and white writers and what have you that had this point of view about racism. I remember reading Dick Gregory's biography. I remember reading, the crime writer. I'm going to forget one of my favorite crime writers, and I'm having a blank right now.
Walter Mosley.
But he wrote, what's that?
Walter Mosley.
What's that?
Walter.
No. He came along later. He's good too, but that's not who I'm thinking of. I'll probably think of it in a minute. But I mean, it led me to reading all these writers, black and white, right. And some of them had a racial viewpoint. Some of them didn't. Some of them were just writing stories. But the kind of stuff that impressed me seemed to have been the kind of things where people did a little of both. So that's my take on it, is that, I believe in empathy. I really do. But I believe that in fiction, not everybody, all characters in humanity are empathetic. And when you're a writer, you're writing about people in humanity. Otherwise, you're just writing Pollyanna stories about how wonderful everything is. Every morning when you get up, everything's fine. But it isn't always fine, but it isn't always bad either.
Right.
Like I say, I remember when Black people had to go to separate restaurants. They didn't have restaurants. They didn't go to restaurants. They had like a few places they could go to. If they went to a restaurant that was white in East Texas, they had to go to the back. And there was a little slit sometimes where they would slide the food out. There was no place frequently for them to sit, or maybe an outside park bench. They couldn't go in the theater unless they went upstairs in the balcony, and they had a separate entrance, because as if you seen a Black person would, do something awful to you. They couldn't go in stores. They couldn't do those things. They had maybe go to the back or go, have somebody go in for them. And people don't remember just how goddamn rotten that was. And so I think we've gone a long ways, but that don't mean we need to take our foot off the gas by any means. But those people who say it's exactly the same. And I remember when gays, man, that was the worst, because if you were gay in East Texas in 1950, there was a good chance somebody was going to kill you. And if you were Black and you say you were sassy, as they would say, then there's a good chance you might be killed or hurt. And women, when I was growing up, there were some women, that would say that my husband has to correct me. Correct you? Because their opinion was different, and because they were considered a chattel in a sense. They were belonged to their husbands. And I remember my mother saying, yeah, that he has to sleep sometime. So that sort of thing would not happen in our house. And but that stuff has changed, and people don't realize how much it's changed. And we don't want to forget it was like that either.
Right.
You don't want to forget it, because that's how things start going back. We're seeing that now.
Yes, we are.
You're seeing people repeating. Nobody learns a goddamn thing from history that I can see, but you're hoping they do. You're hoping they do.
Yes, indeed. All right. So quick interlude for folks who came in a little late. If you have any comments or questions for Joe or me, send in the chat box, and we'll get to a little bit at the end of the show. All right, Joe. So we got a lot still more I want to do, but I don't want to forget this. Okay. So you, if I am correct, and I know I am, you've got a new book out, and let's take a look at it. I'm going to share my screen here. Bear with me, because I always do this wrong. So bear with me for a second. All right. So, all right. We good? You seeing this? There we go. So
seeing it. Yeah.
Tell me about Moon Lake.
Well, I won't talk too much. I don't want to give much away. It's everything's interwoven. But what it is it takes place originally in the late 1960s, and a kid about 13 named Daniel Russell. It starts out with him and his father sitting on a old bridge at night over Moon Lake. And his father is telling him about underneath those waters, there used to be a town, and that he grew up there, and that he met Daniel's mother there, and that they had, lived there, and things were great. And now Daniel's wondering where his mother is. He hasn't seen her in a while. And his mother was a very demanding person, a beautiful woman. And his father was a librarian that felt like he was forced to be an accountant to make her happy. And he's telling all this stuff, and Daniel's, of course, letting us know about a lot of this that he knew about. And the father then decides to drive them off the bridge and into the Moon Lake, and to try and kill them. And so the Daniel is rescued by a fisherman and his daughter, a Black fisherman and his daughter, on the bank, and pulled out of the water. Well, he ends up having to stay with them because he doesn't have any relatives except an aunt who is in Europe. And so while they're waiting for her to return, he lives with them for the summer. And so then he finds for the first time something that resembles what he thought a home should be and a family should be. And then he has to go because his aunt returns, and she's not a warm woman, and she'd really rather not have him there. She tells him right off, "You're not going to want a dog, are you?" And she looks a lot like her sister, I think, because they're twins. And but she is a hard woman, and so she keeps him. And then 10 years later, when he is grown and working for a newspaper in late 1970s, he gets a call from the sheriff, around Moon Lake and says, the lake dried up and we found your father's car and we found his remains in it, but also there are remains in the trunk of the car too.
Oh,
and so he decides to go back and try to figure out what happened.
Wow.
And when he gets there, he finds that there are a lot of things that have to do with his father and a lot of things have absolutely nothing to do with him, but that he gets involved with this interlocking crime and mystery thriller. And then it gets odd from there.
Oh, then it gets odd. Oh, okay.
Yeah, then it gets odd.
All right.
I mean, it's all realistic, and it's based on a lot of true stories, and it's based on a lot of lies and stuff I made up.
All right.
But it also has a lot of social things that I wanted to put in it. So that's as much as I can tell you without giving too much away.
Okay. All right. That was great. But now it's time for a special segment of the show where we spin the wheel. On the wheel are 7 possible categories. Wherever it lands is what you get. And the categories are Silence of the Lambs, Stranger in a Strange Land, Play It Again, San, Thunderdome, Trick or Treat, The Dream Team, and Kick 'Em in the Junks. You ready?
Yeah.
All right, Joe, wherever it lands, that's what you get. And what do we got for you? We got Trick or Treat. Okay. So as a kid, what was your favorite on Halloween? What was your favorite costume?
Well, when I was a kid, Halloween was you went door to door and you trick or treated. They don't do that much now, but people weren't afraid to do that. And you would turn out in packs. And my first costume was Casper the Ghost. And my mother bought it for me. And I had the Casper the Ghost mask with the crooked smile and the little white suit. And I think that was Casper the Ghost, maybe 2 years. And so that was my first one, Casper the Ghost.
All right, fair enough. All right, Joe. So you and I, to very different degrees, of course, are both in the writing business. So let's go to our advice column. What's the best and worst advice someone ever gave you or advice you ever heard about writing?
Well, the best advice came to me over a period of time because several people told it to me, and that's put your ass in the chair and write. And the other good advice is read. As for bad advice is wait for inspiration. Your inspiration, where do you think it comes from? It comes from you. And by showing up every day, you feed it. It's like a beast. And, it may be reluctant to eat at first, but once you start feeding it, that it's gonna keep generating ideas for you. So the muse is you. So get over that whole idea about waiting for inspiration. Create inspiration. I'm always think of the cartoon with the 2 vultures that are sitting on a limb and they're looking out over this bleak desert, and the other one turns to the other buzzard and said, fuck this waiting, let's go out and kill something. And you got to kind of have that attitude, get it done.
All right, right on. All right, so good advice. So now we're going to discuss if you have thick skin. As writers, when we put our work and ourselves out there, criticism of all kinds comes with it, the good, the bad, and everything in between. How do you feel about reviews? Do you take them to heart? Do you let them roll off you, or do some stick with you more than others?
Well, I know friends of mine that get deeply upset about them, and I don't. Everybody prefers good reviews to bad reviews, and then maybe I'd feel different if I got nothing but bad reviews. I might think maybe I didn't know what I was doing. But when I write, I have a motto: as I write, like everybody I know is dead. I'm not worried about agents. I'm not worried about editors. I'm not worried about my friends. I'm not worried about my family. I don't care what they think. And I don't have a beta reader, and I don't, have a manuscript that I pass around. What I do is I write it for me, and I do the best job I can. And I also have a secondary motto, which is fuck the reader when I'm writing. Now, when I get through, then I have a different viewpoint. I hope people like it, but I can't do that when I'm creating. It doesn't mean I don't care about the reader. It means I care about them enough to not to try to guess what everybody wants, because I can't do that. Right. But once I get it finished, it's for me. Now, then when it goes out for reviews, you of course want good reviews. They help promote your work and all that. But I always figure if you believe the good ones, you got to believe the bad ones, right. Unless it's an insane review, because it's just one person's opinion. Right. It's not like Publishers Weekly is like this giant thing where everybody got together and said, Lansdale's novel sucked. One person read it, didn't like it, or one person read it and loved it, So if you put it into perspective, you know how to appreciate good reviews and how to use them as tools. I mean, I get them out there as quick as I can. I post them. I got to look how good they think I am. That's right. Great. but that's what one person thinks.
Fair
And when
enough.
people have bad reviews, I'm not going to promote those, but I accept them and I know they're there and I don't feel offended. And sometimes I think they're right. You
Right.
know, I had a couple of years back, I had a good review, but it had one thing it didn't like. And it really said that. And I thought, yeah, that's about right. I agree with that.
Huh. Right
And
on.
I told my editor, and they were like, really? I said, well, yeah, I mean, that hit it. That's right. You know, so
Fair enough. All right. Right
I
on.
have tough skin anyway. You know, I grew up in East Texas. I grew up poor.
Yeah.
You know, I did martial arts.
Right.
I fought my way to being a writer. I wasn't educated in writing, thank goodness. I learned it from reading and from doing it and from paying attention. I never met another writer till I'd been writing almost, 8 or 9 years. I've been selling, almost 8 or 9 years.
Right. Wow. So
Never met an editor of our publisher till then.
let me ask you about that before we go into take a few questions. So, obviously the writing experience unto itself, it's solitary. It's just you sit down, you clack your keys and you do your thing. But at a certain point, there's a community out there or communities. What was that? Did you sort of, you say you didn't meet other people in the writers
No, I
until
didn't.
later? Was it a sense of like you didn't know what you're missing, or even now it's sort of like, well, it's great that I know them, but it wouldn't have affected me either way? Like, what's your take on that, or how is it for you?
Well, I don't think it would have affected me either way of being a writer. I think what it does, though, is it inspires you because you meet other people who have the same problems or successes that you want, and you can learn from them, and you can get advice, and don't have these stupid ideas about writing that's promoted primarily through films and things like that, and it's not how it works, and it's not glamorous, and it's not romantic, but it's not awful either. And I never felt lonely. I've never understood people that say that I'm alone, but I'm not lonely.
Right.
And I'm only alone for 3 hours a day. And then I go out and do what else I'm going to do that day, martial arts, reading, writing, hanging with my family. And that's one reason I developed that pattern where I can go in and enjoy being with my characters and enjoy being with my story. And then I can get enough of them and go into my regular life.
All right. Fair
So
enough.
I've never had that lonely thing,
Okay. Right on. All right, so we're going to take some questions from the folks. So this is, what was the most difficult work for you to get published after you became a successful author?
They were all about the same. I mean, after I became, I guess successful enough to where I had sold quite a bit, I didn't have any more difficulty selling one than the other. But I would say when I was making that transition from being full-time and learning, I started departing from the kind of stories I had written in the 70s, which were imitative of everybody else's work. And by about 1983, I began to write a different kind of story. I began to write a East Texas JOE R Lansdale story. And those were hard to sell. And some of them, people didn't understand what was going on. They would say, well, this isn't like a horror story. It doesn't end the way I want it to. It doesn't have an upbeat ending, or the dark ending is really, really dark, or there's no supernatural. And, I've done supernatural too. I've done all of it. But that was the time that I had the most trouble, was that transitionary moment. And I probably was a half a dozen stories there, and the Night Runners, which lay unpublished for many, many years. So I would say the Night Runners was probably, which was written in 83, started in 81, finished in 83, because I wrote other novels and short stories during that time. I also did ghost work for some other writers. And so when I wrote that book, I couldn't sell it right away, but it was finished in 83. And then kind of they had this so-called splatterpunk or dark, fiction thing. And it hit then. And so I think it was 88 or 89 when it was published, limited, and then went on to be a paperback. But stories from it, I took things from it, cobbled pieces from it, cannibalized it, as Raymond Chandler used to say, and sold some of them as separate stories. Or I took those sections and revised them, turned them into stories, and sold them. But I would say that probably from 83 really till about 86. And I went full-time in 81, but from 83 to 86 was my transitional period. And then after that, things started falling in place. Let me turn off my phone. I forgot.
No problem. All right, so we got another question for you. What do you think? What do you think is your most underrated work?
Probably Jane Goes North and Fender Lizards.
Why?
Jane Goes North was published by Subterranean beautifully, but it was weird. People didn't know how to review it. They seemed to think it was supposed to be a crime novel or a suspense novel or a horror novel. I don't know what they thought, but it got great reviews, by the way, but it got bad reviews too. And some of the bad reviews were right from that perspective. I always assume everybody's right from their own perspective, but I think it's underrated because I think it's one of my best books. I think it's one of my best written books. I feel the same way about Fender Lizards, which again got great reviews, but it's not a matter of reviews. It's a matter of how its broader spectrum is, you know, what became of it later. And though Jane is not that old, Fender Lizards is moderately old. I feel like that it didn't reach an audience that it could have reached. It reached an audience, an appreciative audience, but neither one have been reprinted yet, though I think they will. And I think those two books, because they're not part of normal genre books, and I think most of the stuff I write doesn't fit well in any category to begin with, but these I think really don't. Right. And so I would say those two. And of the books that people know of mine, I would think Freezer Burn may be underappreciated. So I'd say those three.
All right. So let me ask you, I wanted to get to this earlier. So Happen Leonard has been translated into a very successful TV show. But given how difficult it can be to get anything made in the Hollywood world, tell me about how your series made it to the screen.
Lowell Northrop. Savage Season was once optioned by John Badham, you know, and before they got through with the script, the original script was terrific, but before they got through with it, it was about running the rapids in Colorado or something, and Leonard was no longer gay, and it was just, you know, nothing like the book. And and then I had the Two Bear Mambo was optioned. I wrote a screenplay for it, nothing. The Mucho Mojo was optioned. Ted Talley, who did Silence of the Lambs screenplay, did a great screenplay on it. But right when they got close to shooting, it's supposed to have been, as I remember, Don Cheadle and Josh Lucas as the main characters.
Wow.
It didn't happen. But Lowell Northrop optioned Savage Season. I wrote a screenplay for him. And about this time, we were having these changes in television, and television was starting to be really more exciting than film.
Right.
And Sundance Channel came along, and Lowell sort of introduced this stuff to Jim Mickle and Nick D'Amici, who were producers and director and writer on the series. And they then took it to Sundance. And that's kind of how it happened. But I give Lowell Northrop the most credit for putting it out there in such a way that these extremely talented people like Jim Mickle, his Sweet Tooth is his most recent film. And he also directed Cold in July. He had directed that first. So it was this, and he'd always been talking about doing Happen Leonard. So it wasn't that Lowell had totally introduced Happen Leonard to him, but Lowell was like a bulldog and he stayed with it. And then Jim and Nick were like bulldogs. So you had this group of very, you know, tenacious people trying to do this. And it took them several years to get there. And once it went to Sundance, it was their most popular show for all 3 seasons. Yeah. But as these things often happen, Sundance decided to change its methodology, so to speak, meaning that somebody new probably came in and then they didn't get the show, as they love to say. And it was terrible because it was their number 1 show. It was wonderful. James Purefoy and Michael K. Williams are absolutely wonderful.
Oh, they're great.
Christina Hendricks in the first season was great. You know, Bill Sage, Neil Sandilands, and Jeff Pope, and there's so many more that I don't have time to list. But you know, and then it went into the 2nd and 3rd season with different guest stars and scripts by a variety of people, mostly Nick D'Amici and to some extent Jim Mickle, who directed a large number of them, with Nick Gomez and who else ever was involved in that. So I was fortunate. I got people that got the work.
Did they ask for your input into the show at all? Were you involved?
Yeah, but they don't think they meant it. you know, that I always had to joke is that I get to say whatever I want and they get to do whatever they want.
Right.
But
Fair enough.
Jim and Nick were very, very good about listening to me. I love both those guys. I always kid that, you know, Jim's like my nephew, and in a way he is, you know, and he's getting to be a big nephew now. He's starting to do really, really well, you know, but, they did let me have a lot more input the first season because Jim was the showrunner. And then by the second season, they brought in a regular TV showrunner who was very good too, John Worth. And I think I got a little sideways with him on the second season, and I got banned from the set before I ever got on it. I was on the first season, and I was on the third season. But I think it was mostly because I don't hold back in my opinions, which you may have found out. But when I think something wrong, when I think something wrong, I say so. And when I think it's right, I say so. But I also, and this is what I don't think that some people understood, I also think that it's their film. I was a producer, but I only had, my producing was more or less, I provided the material. I wrote a script for the second season. Right. I felt like they took some bad turns. I said something about it. They didn't, the showrunner didn't agree with me, he's become a friend. Don't get me wrong. And it's his right to do that. It's his right to look at it and say, this isn't what I was wanting. But also, I think it was also a misunderstanding because I can be pretty blunt. But if you see me in person, it doesn't strike you the same way as it might in an email. But and here's the thing that's ironic. They didn't do the things I disliked. They did the things more that I like. So in the long run, it kind of went the direction I wanted. And there are changes in this thing that I don't necessarily love, but that's expected. You don't expect everything to go your way. That's not being realistic. And if I weren't a producer on it of any sort, I would have never said anything. Right. Unless somebody said, "What do you think?" In Cold in July, when they did that, I had a producer credit, but I wasn't actually a producer in the sense of having some input. They would ask me something once in a while, and I would be, tell them. But I always told Jim, I said, remember, in the end, it's your movie, man. You do as you will do. Now, do I love that all the time? No, but that's realistic. So I'm supposed to direct one myself. So my plan is to direct one, and I'm basing it. It's based on my work. My son wrote the screenplay. I love it, and I'll probably change things and make him mad.
All right. Wait. So one last question. You touched on Cold in July, and then we're going to wrap up. So Dexter, at least the first 4 seasons, is some of my favorite TV of all time. What was it like to get Michael C. Hall in the movie version of Cold in July?
It was great. I mean, he's such a sweetheart. We really loved him. I remember one night we were having dinner, and my son was with us, and my son had these pictures of his friend painting, and I'm not sure why he ended up showing it to Michael or whatever, but he did. And Michael said, that looks like Dexter's kill room because it had all this plastic on the wall. And so he called that guy and said, this is Dexter, and you need to cover the ceiling too. And that kid just got when he realized it was really Michael, he got the biggest treat out of it. And I just thought that was sweet beyond. And Don Johnson was a hoot. And Sam Shepard was a fascinating guy. I was really glad I got to talk with him and visit with him some. He wasn't easy to visit with all the time, but it was a great experience. And Jim and Nick, who wrote the script, were just wonderful. Everybody on it was fantastic. I didn't see the whole filming, but I was there for a while. And then my daughter was there and my son at different times, and we kind of overlapped. And so it was a great moment. I had a great time, and there were a lot of funny things, behind the scenes that happened that I remember that, we enjoyed.
Right. Okay. So we're just about out of time. I just want to do one last thing and we're good to go. Give me 1 second. Of course, I lost my place, as I do from time to time. I want to get these images back up. Okay. So hang on. I'm going to share my screen one more time, and I'm going to go back to your book. All right. So you talked about Moon Lake. What's next? What's coming? What's after this for you?
Well, I've got a book coming out for Subterranean called Radiant Apples, and it's in the vein. It's Nat Love. I wrote about this character in Paradise Sky, Black Hat Jack, Everything Sparkles in Hell, and a couple of short stories. And this is a short novel, is really what it is, and about Nat in his later days when he's working as a porter for the railroad in East Texas, and how it leads to another adventure with him having an opportunity to go back and do what he did as a marshal. Because there were black marshals that a lot of people don't know about, Bass Reeves being the most famous of the black marshals that worked for hanging Judge Parker. And so anyway, it's that character that's next, and I'm working on a new novel now.
All right, great. Well, Joe, this was a great show, and thanks for everyone who's watching. I'm your host, Russ Colchamiro. And since we've been talking about, especially with Joe, about books that don't always fill neatly into a category, if you're up for a little Blade Runner style sci-fi with your crime and mystery, check out my sci-fi noir, Crackle and Fire, featuring my hard-boiled intergalactic private eye, Angela Hardwick, who is hired to find a missing intern with stolen corporate files, but soon finds herself tackling with dueling gangsters, hostile protesters, and a madman from Earth with galactic ambitions from his own. Crackle and Fire is available on Amazon and published by Crazy 8 Press. And the follow-up to Crackle and Fire will be out this September. Title and cover reveals coming soon. All right, Joe, I want to thank you again for coming on to a show. This was absolutely great. I really appreciate the time, and I want to appreciate everyone who's watching at home. This was a great hour, and I'll see everybody next week. All right, thanks a lot. Take care, guys.